Imagine waking up on April 15th and realizing the date doesn't matter anymore. No more frantic filing, no more digging through shoeboxes of receipts, and most importantly, no more checks written to the Internal Revenue Service. It sounds like a libertarian fever dream. But there is a serious, high-level intelligence report circulating that suggests we are moving toward exactly that. A world where the IRS is replaced by something called the ERS, the External Revenue Service.
It's a massive paradigm shift. We're talking about moving from a system that taxes internal productivity, your income, my labor, to a system that taxes external entry. The ERS isn't just a name change. It's a fundamental restructuring of how a superpower funds itself. If the IRS is the vacuum cleaner in your living room, the ERS is the toll booth at the front gate.
That's a vivid way to put it. But let's look at the how here. If we're dismantling the internal machinery, what actually makes up this External Revenue Service? Is it just a fancy word for a customs office, or is it something more complex?
It's much more robust. According to the MOST and SWOT analyses we're looking at, the ERS is a composite entity. It's built primarily on a foundation of aggressive tariffs, but it also incorporates what are being called security funds. These aren't just taxes on goods, they are essentially fees for access to the American consumer market and the security umbrella the US provides. It's a pay-to-play model for global trade.
So, instead of taxing the worker, you're taxing the product at the border. But let's get to the brass tacks, the money. There's been a lot of talk about tariffs since 2025. Has this actually generated real revenue? Or is it just a political talking point that looks good on a bumper sticker?
The data since 2025 shows a surprising surge. We've seen billions flowing in, but the real question is who is actually benefiting. Historically, people argued tariffs are just a tax on the consumer, but the recent shift suggests a different beneficiary profile. The primary winners have been domestic manufacturers who finally have the breathing room to compete with subsidized foreign goods. But there's a secondary winner, the executive branch's discretionary power. When the revenue is external, the oversight often becomes a bit more opaque than traditional tax law.
That brings us to a very sensitive area, the general fund. For the average person, the government's money is just one big pot. But it's not, is it? Is the general fund a public piggy bank? Or is there a private element to it that we aren't being told about?
This is where the SWOT analysis gets a bit dark. The general fund is technically public, but its management has become a hybrid. It's a combination of public mandates and private sector management strategies. Think of it as a public fund that operates with the aggression and secrecy of a private hedge fund. And that's where the distinction between the general fund and trust funds becomes vital.
Right. Because we always hear about Social Security or Medicare trust funds. How do they differ from that main general fund pot?
Think of a trust fund as a restricted gift. It's money legally earmarked for a specific purpose, like your retirement. The government is supposed to be just the custodian. The general fund, however, is the operating budget. It's the everything else fund. The danger, and what the report hints at, is the blurring of these lines. When the general fund runs dry, the government often borrows from the trust funds, replacing your hard-earned cash with what are essentially IOUs.
Which leads perfectly into the big elephant in the room, the national debt. We're sitting at over $34 trillion. It's a number so large it almost feels fake. Can an external revenue service or a new tariff regime actually move the needle on a debt that massive?
That is the trillion-dollar question. If you look at the MOST analysis, mission, objective, strategy, and tactics, the mission is debt stabilization. But the SWOT analysis shows a massive threat in that column. Even with record-breaking tariff revenue, if the spending isn't curtailed, the ERS is just a band-aid on a gunshot wound. Tariffs can provide a new revenue stream, sure, but they can't fix a systemic spending addiction.
It's a lot to process. It feels like we're standing at a crossroads of how the nation defines its own value. Before we dive into the deeper, more controversial questions about corruption and the future of that debt, we need to take a quick second to acknowledge the platform that makes these deep dives possible.
Absolutely. You're listening to The New Sentinel. We're a podcast dedicated to providing these kinds of in-depth discussions and deep dives into a wide array of topics. We don't just stay in one lane. From the glitz and glamour of pop culture to the strategic intricacies of military operations like the one we're discussing today, we cover it all.
Exactly. Each episode is thoughtfully crafted to offer you a comprehensive understanding of the subject matter. We bring in the analysis, the storytelling, and the data you won't find in a 30-second news clip. Whether you're a pop culture enthusiast or someone with a keen interest in global security and fiscal policy, The New Sentinel has something for you.
So, if you're finding this breakdown of the IRS versus the ERS helpful, make sure to tune in, comment, like, and subscribe. Share this episode to help others stay informed and entertained. Now let's get back to the heavy stuff.
We were talking about the general fund. There's a persistent whisper, and sometimes a shout, that the government has engaged, or intends to engage, in corrupt practices regarding how that fund is managed. When you have billions moving through an external revenue service without the same level of public scrutiny as the old IRS, does that open the door for systemic graft?
The risk is undeniably higher. In a traditional tax system, there is a paper trail for every citizen. In a tariff-based ERS system, the deals are made at the corporate and state levels. The report we're looking at identifies opportunities for corruption as a significant weakness in the SWOT matrix. It's much easier to grant a tariff waiver to a political donor than it is to tell a specific citizen they don't have to pay income tax. It creates a system of winners and losers decided by bureaucrats rather than by the market.
And that's the philosophical pivot, isn't it? We're moving from a system where the government is accountable to the taxpayer, because the taxpayer provides the funds, to a system where the government is funded by the outside. Does that mean the government stops feeling accountable to its own people?
That is the deep-seated fear. If the people aren't the ones paying the bills, do the people still hold the power? If the ERS successfully replaces the IRS, the financial tether between the citizen and the state is severed. On one hand, you're free from income tax. On the other hand, you might lose your seat at the table because you're no longer the primary stakeholder in the government's eyes.
It's a be careful what you wish for scenario. We hate the IRS, but the IRS is the proof that the government works for us, or is supposed to. If we shift to tariffs and external security funds, we're essentially turning the country into a gated community, where the management gets its money from the visitors, not the residents.
And those residents might find that the management stops listening to their complaints about the landscaping. When we look at the US national debt, the ERS is being pitched as the savior. But if the ERS also facilitates a lack of transparency and opens the door for the mismanagement of the general fund, we might just be trading one fiscal crisis for a much more dangerous systemic one.
It's a fascinating, if slightly terrifying, look into the next decade of American policy. The idea that 2025 was the starting line for this external shift really puts our current economic headlines into a new perspective.
It really does. We are watching the transition from a 20th century tax state to a 21st century fortress economy. Whether that fortress is built to protect the citizens or just to protect the fund managers remains to be seen.
As we wrap up today's deep dive, it's worth asking ourselves, if you never had to file a tax return again, but you knew your government was being funded by opaque international trade deals and security funds you couldn't track, would you take that deal? Is the privacy of your paycheck worth the transparency of your democracy?
That's the question that will likely define the next generation of American politics. The ERS isn't just a policy change, it's a rewrite of the social contract. And as the national debt continues to climb, the pressure to sign that new contract is only going to get stronger.
Food for thought as we move into a very uncertain fiscal future. We'll be keeping a close eye on the ERS and the evolution of the general fund. This is a story that's only just beginning to unfold. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you in the next episode.